My name is Danielle Berger, and today we're going to be discussing Ivan Pavlov's theory of behavioral and social learning. The objectives for today are to discover who Ivan Pavlov is, what is Pavlovian conditioning, compare the behavior theory to the social learning theory, how has Pavlov's classical behavior theory impacted education, and how could the social learning theory be used in the classroom. Who is Ivan Pavlov? Ivan Pavlov was born on September 14, 1849, in a small village in Ryazan, Russia, where his father was the village priest. His earliest studies were focused on theology, but after reading Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, he had a powerful influence on his future interests. He soon abandoned his religious studies and devoted himself to the study of science. In 1870, he began studying the natural sciences at the University of St. Petersburg in Russia. His career, Ivan Pavlov's primary interests were the study of physiology and natural sciences. Like many great scientific advances, classical conditioning was discovered almost by accident. During the 1890s, Pavlov's initial research was to study the role of salivation in digestion. In Pavlov's experiments, he was accomplishing this by looking at the salivation of dogs in response to being fed. He would measure how much saliva dogs would produce when given meat. After measuring this for a few days, Pavlov started to notice that the dogs in his laboratory started to salivate whenever he entered the laboratory with the meat dish before the meat was even entered into their mouths. Pavlov also noticed that the dogs would salivate when he entered the room, even when he was not even bringing them food. Seeing that the dogs would salivate even when no food was being brought to them made Pavlov curious, and he began a series of experiments. Pavlovian conditioning started in 1902 with the idea that there are some things a dog does that does not need to be learned, such as the dogs do not need to learn to salivate whenever they see food. This is a natural reflex for the dog, and according to behaviorists, it is an unconditioned response. An unconditioned response means that it is a stimulus response in which no learning is required. What Pavlov saw was that the unconditioned stimulus was the food, and the unconditioned response was to salivate. Pavlov showed this unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and then measuring its salivary secretions. In the next presentation part, I'm going to be showing you a picture that explains the salivation of dogs in Pavlovian conditioning. When looking at this figure presented here, it shows the unconditioned stimulus being the food and the unconditioned response being to salivate. And it shows the method Pavlov used to measure the amount of salivation that was produced. Pavlov realized that the dogs in his lab had learned to associate his lab attendant with food, and that this response must have been learned because the dogs did not show this behavior with the lab attendant at first. So at first there was no type of stimulus in reaction in response to the lab attendant. The dog's behavior had changed because they learned that when the lab attendant came into the room, that meant the dogs were going to receive food. According to behaviorists, originally the lab attendant was a neutral stimulus because the dogs did not show a response. However, the dogs learned to associate the lab attendant with the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food. Pavlov wanted to test this theory and began a series of experiments in which Pavlov used a bell as the neutral stimulus. Whenever he gave the dogs food, he would ring the bell before giving them food. After the dogs had heard the bell many times, right before before getting fed, the dogs began to salivate as soon as the bell rang. The dog had now been conditioned to salivate in response to the new stimulus, the bell, that before did not create a response. The dogs had learned to associate the bell with food. Pavlov discovered that in order for the response to be learned, the two stimuli had to be presented close together in time. Learning would not occur if the time between the conditioned stimulus, which was the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, the food, was too great. Now I'm going to show you a figure in which his experiments were looked at with the dogs. The unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, which is the food, is the object or event that originally produces the reflexive natural response. The response to this is called the unconditioned response, or UCR, which in this case is salvation. The neutral stimulus, in S, is a new stimulus that does not produce a response, which was the bell when it was first introduced. So notice that in the second picture, the bell did not produce a response because it was a neutral stimulus. Once the neutral stimulus has become associated with the unconditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus, which they abbreviated as CS, in which the bell became a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response, CR, is the response to the conditioned stimulus, which the dog's salvation was the conditioned response to the bell. So that's what this figure shows, is his conditioning with the dogs and his experience. Pavlov's work is known as classical conditioning. In the classical conditioning behavioral theory, there was no new behavior learned, but an association was made between a new stimulus and an existing response. Pavlov discovered that we make associations that cause us to generalize our response to one stimuli onto a neutral stimuli it is paired with. Pavlov's classical conditioning work and experiments have become famous since his work between 1890 and 1930. In 1904, Ivan Pavlov won a Nobel Prize for his work in this classical conditioning and physiology. So the big idea. Now that we have explained the experiments that Ivan Pavlov used to discover the behaviorist theory of classical conditioning, I would like you to take a moment, and I'll give you about 20 to 30 seconds to reflect on the experiments that we just learned about and try to come up with how this can be related to the classroom. So go ahead and have about 20 seconds of think time and how this can relate to the classroom. So now that you've had time to think, when applying classical conditioning in the classroom, classical conditioning is the main behavior in association. Teachers must encourage students to associate a variety of positive and pleasant events with learning and classroom activities. For example, a teacher might use attractive learning aids. They might decorate the classrooms in a positive way. Encourage students to work in small groups when completing difficult activities so that it's a positive feeling for them in response. Greet the students and smile at them when they come into the classroom. Inform the students clearly about the format of quiz, tests, and exams. Allow the students to understand the rules of the classroom. And give students appropriate time to prepare and complete learning tasks so that they have a positive response. Behavioral versus social learning theory. In behaviorism, a theory in is a theory in that the learner is essentially passive in responding to environmental stimuli. The behavioral theory focuses on learning that is due to different changes in behavior. Behavioral explanations show how environmental interactions influences behavior. While based on behavioral theory of classical learning, the social learning theory goes further in arguing that children learn in more ways than by direct influences. The social learning theory extends behaviorism and emerged from the work of Albert Bandura. It emphasizes the importance of observing and modeling the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. It focuses on how people adopt different behavioral patterns and how they maintain them in their lives. It discusses how both environmental and cognitive factors interact to influence human learning and behavior. Social learning theory believes that students learn by observing or watching and imitating other people. This is called modeling or observational learning. Social learning and behaviorism agree that experience is an important cause of learning. For example, the dogs experienced that the lab attendant was associated with meat, so they would start to salivate, and the dogs learned this behavior. When applying the social learning theory to the classroom, there are 4 processes involved in social learning. Attention. Before students can imitate a model's behavior, the student must be paying attention to what the model is doing or saying. Retention. Students must be able to store the model's actions in their memory and have retention of the model's behavior. Production. The student has to be able to reproduce the model's action. And lastly, motivation. The students need to be motivated to show and reproduce the model's actions. Reinforcement can encourage observational learning. In review, Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist who used experiments with dogs to discover the classical conditioning theory and won many prizes for his work. He showed that behavior is an association made between a new stimulus and an existing response in which no new learning occurs. Behaviorism is a theory in which humans learn to respond to environmental stimuli, whereas social learning theory believes that humans learn by observing or watching and imitating other people. So here is your challenge. Now that you know how teachers can use the classical conditioning theory in the classroom by associating with a variety of positive and pleasant events, it is time for you and your classmates to discuss examples of how this classical conditioning theory can be used by you as a teacher. I want you to give examples of associated learning that students can be conditioned to in the classroom and how this is important for you as a teacher. How might the classical conditioning theory create negative associations for students, and how would you counter those conditions? And lastly, what are some examples of how you as a teacher could use the social learning theory in the classroom? So now this is my challenge to you, and I hope you enjoyed learning about Ivan Pavlov's behavioral and social learning theory.